Hi everyone, this video is on the effect of automatic and discretionary stabilisers. I won't be spending too much time on what automatic and discretionary stabilisers are. So if you're a little unsure of that, maybe go and review some of your resources on that first before checking out this video. All right, so we're going to start with here the business cycle, which we all should be very familiar with by now. And just to remind you that this represents levels of economic activity, generally real GDP. And we want to avoid, where possible, these significant areas at the top of massive high growth, because what's associated with really high growth is we've got resource scarcity, and we're going to approach that level of productive capacity, and as a result we're going to have really high levels of inflation, hurting purchasing power, and then therefore access to goods and services and material living standards. And likewise, we really want to avoid these big deep troughs as well that have extended below 0% GDP growth, and the reason for that is there's not a lot of production going on around these times, and if there's not a lot of production, there's not a lot of derived demand for labor. And if people aren't needed, then they ain't going to have jobs. And if people don't have jobs, well, then again, their incomes will fall, access to goods and services will fall, their material living standards will fall. Okay, so we want to, where possible, avoid these peaks and troughs. And the government, through their automatic stabilisers, will ideally get the economy to a system where the peaks and troughs are kind of squished out, as you'll see here on the chart here, having a nice, consistent level of economic growth over time. So what are the effects of these things? Okay, so let's go through four main effects. The first one here is the influence of automatic stabilisers on aggregate demand and the business cycle. For the purposes of this slide, we're just going to go with when there's an upswing. Now, if there's a downturn in economic activity, the effects are just reversed. Okay, so there's no point going through those as well. So when there's an upswing in the business cycle, you're going to find workers falling into what we call here higher tax brackets. Okay, higher tax brackets. I've crossed that out. Didn't mean to cross it out. Meant to underline it, but I didn't. What does that mean? Well, in Australia here, we have the progressive tax system, meaning the more that people earn in income, then the higher the rate of tax that they're taxed on that additional earnings. And so when there is a higher derived demand for labour due to the upswing, people are just automatically, the government doesn't have to change any policy, automatically fall into higher tax brackets. And as a result, the level of leakages that are leaking out of the economy is increasing. Okay, and remember, the goal here in an upswing is to slow down that peak so we don't have those massive, high peaks. We want to slow it down. So if this stabilizer wasn't in place, if we didn't have progressive tax system, well, the economic growth would just keep going up and up and up because people would just have more and more money to spend. But that's not how it works. So by workers falling into higher tax brackets, leakages will rise, and therefore private consumption and private investment then will fall, and slowing of economic activity. So that's on one side here on the leakages side. On the other side here, we've also got the injection side. So if we think about the role of the government is to provide welfare for those who need it. And in an upswing, there's an increase in the derived demand for labour, which means people will be transitioning from welfare to employment. And then so the government will no longer be sending welfare payments to a lot of these individuals. And so as a result of people transitioning from welfare to employment, the level of injections, the money pumping into the economy, will actually fall. And so collectively, with both a rise in leakages on the income tax side and a fall in injections on the welfare side, collectively there'll be less money circulating around the economy and therefore a slowing of economic activity. And this is a really important part to remember is a common trap for students to understand when they're learning these concepts is when things are going well and economic growth is going up, it's easy to explain incorrectly in your responses that the government just wants to kind of keep speeding up the economy. And you've got to remember what we're trying to do here is to stop through these automatic stabilizers. We're stopping those really high peaks of economic activity, reaching levels of productive capacity and therefore inflation. And so when things are going well, that's good because people have jobs, but we just don't want them to be going too well. And that's where the automatic stabilizers come in here to, as the word says, stabilize the level of economic activity. Cool. Next one. So when we have an upswing, there's an effect on the budget outcome. Whenever you get a question on how to explain the effect to the budget outcome, you've got to kind of do this part first, because you're going to have to explain that as a result of this automatic stabilisers, there's more tax being paid and less welfare being received. And that will then enable you to get to these arguments here of that the level of tax receipts will go up and the welfare payments or welfare expenditure will go down. And if we think of the budget outcome, we've got those two sides of it, of receipts and expenditure. And in order to explain why receipts change and why expenditure changes, you've got to kind of talk about this idea first. Okay, so that's like a little tip for you, is you can't just jump straight to the budget outcome as its own independent idea. Go through the influence on the AD idea first of welfare and tax. As a result of higher tax receipts and lower welfare expenditure, that's going to either, depending on where the economy currently is, it's either going to move the economy, if they're already in deficit, towards surplus, or if the economy or the budget outcome is already in surplus, it's going to move the budget outcome further into surplus. So just be really careful of the language that you're using here. Speak to your teacher or your resources about where the current budget outcome plan is to make sure you're using the right language here. And then the final one here is the effect on government debt. Similarly to what I said before, it's a nice idea if you have to talk about the government debt, you kind of got to talk about the, step 1, step 2, and then step 3, because you've got to talk about, well, does the government have more or less money now than they had planned to get? And as a result of the higher tax receipts, more money coming in. As a result of lower welfare expenditure, less money going out, they've got more money left over. And so as a result, they can use those funds to pay back the debt that they have already accumulated in years gone by. Now with discretionary, the idea is very similar. So obviously we have here the peaks and troughs. The government wants this to happen. And so if they were to not have discretionary stabilisers and just leave it up to the automatic, they would still be able to flatten out the business cycle, but not to the extreme level that they want. So discretionary stabilisers, don't forget, are the specific government policies. This is kind of the easier one to understand, if I'm going to be completely honest. It's the automatic that sometimes can be a bit tricky, because this is just in an upswing. Remember, what do we want the government to do? So if we're in an upswing, just have a think, because it's easy to pick the wrong one here. What should discretionary stabilisers be doing? And they should actually be slowing down levels of economic activity, again, to avoid those really high peaks. And so how are they going to do that? Well, they are going to pull government expenditure projects. So often this will be cuts. You might hear the word cuts being used, cuts to this, cuts to this. So if they had planned or they had in prior years spent $400 million on a particular program, they might spend $200 million on the program or just cut it entirely. So that's one way to then reduce the amount of injections in the economy. Or they might also instigate revenue-raising activities. So an example that we will use as an easy one would be like an increase to the tax rate or something like that. It's much easier for the government just to pull expenditure than it is to create revenue-raising activities, because those are not very politically popular. But when that happens, when either of those two things happen, C&I will fall and seeing the slowing of economic activity. So you're going to find on the effect side here, they're all exactly the same as your automatic. So both the automatic and discretionary aim to do exactly the same thing. Similarly here, we have increased receipts relative to expenditure. This is exactly the same as the one before, because the government is spending less money or receiving more money. Their receipts increase relative to expenditure. Therefore moving the budget towards surplus if they're in deficit, or further into surplus if they're already in surplus. And then again, the effect on government debt. If they've got more money now as a result of these activities, then they can use that to pay down existing debt. So I hope that's helpful on the effects of automatic and discretionary stabilizers. Feel free to go back and look over some of the trickier concepts, especially like why does the government want to slow down economic growth, and on the automatic side. I've got the little icon here. No, that's not like a man peeking below his hat level. It's not that. It's a turtle. Why is it a turtle? Because we want to slow down the peaks and troughs. That's really the main idea here. It was an icon that came up, and I thought it was fun. hopefully that was helpful for everybody. Happy learning.